On Christmas Eve, my son closed the door in my face and said, "You're not family anymore." The words were not shouted, not screamed, but spoken with a cold finality that cut deeper than any blade. For a moment, the snow outside seemed quieter, the lights in the windows dimmer. I stood there, coat buttoned, gift in hand, watching the home I had built with my bare hands no longer welcome me inside. Betrayal, I realized, does not always come with fists or fury. It can arrive dressed in silence, wrapped in the steady voice of your own blood. I wanted to answer him, to remind him of the winters when he was small, when I carried him on my shoulders so he could see the star atop the town's Christmas tree. To remind him of the years I worked 2 jobs just so he could have a warm coat, so his stockings would never hang empty by the fire. But words froze on my lips, my breath clouded in the air, unspoken, while his hand remained firm on the door. His wife stood behind him, her eyes sharp with triumph. It was she who whispered poison over the years. I had seen it in the way her smile curled when she spoke of inheritance, of modern families where old men were burdens. And now she stood victorious as my son repeated her verdict. "You're not family anymore." The door closed, but it did not slam. That, somehow, was worse. The sound was deliberate, careful, as though my exile was not born of passion, but of certainty. In that moment, the weight of years collapsed upon me. The house behind that door was not just brick and wood. It was decades of my sweat, my laughter, my prayers whispered into rafters as I hammered them into place. Now, I was a stranger to my own creation. I turned away slowly, the snow crunching under my boots, each step heavier than the last. My heart did not race. It sank. Betrayal does not raise its voice. Betrayal whispers in familiar tones and leaves you with silence. And silence was all that followed me down the empty street, carrying with it the bitter truth. I had been erased, not by enemies, but by my own son. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Please write in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something like this in your own life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. By doing so, you truly help us grow this channel and bring more stories like this to life. And now, we continue. At first, it was subtle. My chair at the dinner table shifted just a little farther from the center. A small thing, easy to dismiss, but heavy with meaning. Where once I had sat close, carving the roast and pouring wine for my family, I now found myself at the edge, almost as though I were a guest. I told myself it was nothing, that age made me sensitive, that I should be grateful just to sit among them. But each gathering pushed me farther still, until one day my place disappeared altogether. I stood in the doorway that evening, watching them laugh, plates gleaming, glasses raised. My son sat at the head where I once presided, his wife at his side, their smiles wide as if they had conquered something worth celebrating. The table looked perfect, polished, full, except for the empty space where I no longer belonged. My chair had not been forgotten. It had been erased. The sight was harder to bear than any words. Family should be a circle, unbroken, but here the circle was sealed without me. Their laughter rang hollow in my ears, every sound reminding me that joy had been redefined to exclude me. Even the children, my grandchildren, were taught to see me as a shadow, someone who used to matter, someone now moved aside. I could not remember the moment it began, only the slow erosion of my place. First, my stories were too long, then my opinions outdated. Soon my silence was preferable to my voice. What they called respect for the new generation was nothing more than exile wrapped in politeness. I sat alone in the kitchen that night, a plate set aside for me not at the table, but on the counter, as though I were no longer part of the family, but part of the household clutter. I ate quietly, staring at my hands, the same hands that once built the roof over their heads, the same hands that had carried them when they were too small to walk. Now, They were just trembling reminders of a man they wished gone. There is no pain sharper than watching your place in your own family vanish. Not by accident, but by design. My chair was gone, but what truly broke me was their smile while it happened. As if the burden of my existence had finally been lifted, and they could eat freely, laugh freely, live freely, without the weight of the man who had given them everything. It began with a glance, a smirk passed between them when I fumbled with a glass or dropped a fork. My hands, once strong enough to carry beams of wood, to hammer nails into walls that still stand today, now shook when lifting a cup of tea. To me, they were the hands of survival, proof that I had worked, sacrificed, endured. To them, they were nothing more than trembling reminders of weakness. Whispers rose when they thought I could not hear. Look at him, useless now, can't even hold a spoon steady. My past, the years I had bent my back to give them comfort, became invisible. Wrinkles, carved into my skin by nights without sleep and days without rest, were turned into insults, as though each line was proof not of sacrifice, but of failure. I remembered the nights I came home with dirt embedded in my nails, my body aching, yet still lifted my son onto my shoulders so he could feel tall, so he could believe his father was unshakable. I remembered the winters when I walked through storms to earn wages that barely kept us warm, never once letting him see the cold inside me. Every wrinkle I carried was born from those years, but now those marks were dismissed as decay. They laughed at my shoes, the ones worn from years of labor, and compared them to the polished leather on their own feet. They mocked the way I leaned on the table for balance, as though strength had never once lived in my frame. Their smiles were sharper than knives, their laughter louder than truth, and I felt the crushing weight of invisibility settle deeper with every sound. Age is not a thief, it is a record. Yet in their eyes, it stripped me bare of dignity, erased every memory of sacrifice, leaving only what they chose to see. An old man past his use. The very years I had given them became the weapon with which they cut me down. I sat silently, enduring it because rage would only prove their point. But inside my heart burned, not with anger for myself, but with sorrow that my own blood had grown blind to the honor of age. They could not see that these trembling hands had once built the very table at which they now feasted, that this bent back had once carried them into life. Every line on my face, every scar, every mark was a story of love disguised as labor, but to them it was nothing but evidence that I no longer belonged. And as their laughter echoed in the room, I understood the cruelty of time, not that it takes strength away, but that it gives others the excuse to forget what that strength once built. The house that once held my laughter no longer knew my name. Its walls, raised by my sweat and steady hands, had begun to echo with foreign voices, tones that carried no memory of the nights I labored to give them shelter. I walked through rooms that were once alive with family, and each step felt like trespassing. My photographs, once lined across the mantel like milestones of a life built with love, had been replaced by polished frames of vacations I was never invited to, faces smiling without me. My own portrait, the one where I held my infant son proudly in my arms, was taken down, tucked away in some forgotten drawer, as though erasing me from the walls could erase me from history. My room, once a refuge where I had prayed in silence, dreamed in weary hope, and laid down bones aching from work, was stripped of its soul. The bed where I had rested after years of sacrifice had been pushed to the corner, covered in boxes, old coats, and broken toys. It was no longer a room, it was storage, a place for things unwanted but not yet discarded. And in their eyes I had become the same. I moved quietly, almost like a ghost, careful not to disturb the life they had rebuilt without me. Their laughter came from the living room, bright and careless, carrying on as though I did not exist. The sound should have warmed me. It once had. But now it only hollowed me further, reminding me that joy could thrive even when I was forgotten, or perhaps because I was forgotten. I sat in the shadows, the corners where they allowed me to remain, and I saw how the home I had created had shifted its heart. Every brick I laid, every nail I hammered, every sacrifice I made for its foundation had been turned against me. The house was standing, yes, but it no longer sheltered me. Instead, it sheltered the belief that I was unnecessary, a relic of the past whose presence was tolerated only out of obligation. The betrayal was not in words, but in the silence of walls that no longer bore my touch, in the sight of rooms that treated me as an intruder. Home had become a stranger to me, and I to it. And nothing wounds deeper than standing inside the very walls you built and realizing you no longer belong. For months I carried my silence like a stone in my chest, letting their whispers wash over me, letting their laughter cut me deeper than knives. They thought they had buried me alive, that I would fade quietly into the corners until I disappeared completely. They had no idea that while they plotted over dinners and whispered about inheritance, I had already prepared my final word. In the bottom drawer of my desk, beneath old letters and folded receipts, lay an envelope untouched. Its paper was plain, but the weight inside it could shift an entire house. That letter was my last voice, not shouted in anger, but written in truth, entrusted to a lawyer who had promised me one thing, that my silence would not mean defeat. The family believed they were building their future on my back, tearing away the pieces of my dignity while sharpening their knives for what I would leave behind. They looked at me as though I were already gone, a living shadow only waiting for the end. But what they did not see was the ink that waited, the pages that carried every word they had refused to hear from my mouth. I had written not with rage, but with memory, not with curses, but with facts that no laughter could erase. I remembered the night I sealed that envelope. My hands trembled, but not from weakness. They trembled from the weight of justice, from the knowledge that the same hands they mocked would be the hands that signed the truth they could not bury. I pressed the seal shut and whispered to myself that I was not writing for revenge. I was writing so my name would never be stolen from me, so my sacrifices would not vanish when their greed tried to erase them. The lawyer was a quiet man, gray-haired, with eyes that did not judge. He promised me he would keep the letter safe, that when the time came, my voice would fill the room, even if I could not. And so I waited, not for their kindness, not for their respect, because I had already accepted those would never return. I waited for the moment the letter would rise in my place, when ink would speak louder than all the silences they had forced upon me. They thought they had silenced me forever. They did not know that justice was already sealed, waiting in the drawer, waiting in the hands of the lawyer who would one day read aloud the truth they feared most, that the man they had cast aside was not gone, not forgotten, and not defeated. The day of the reading arrived, and the air in the house was heavy with anticipation. They gathered around the long table, polished and gleaming, the same table I had built decades ago with my own hands. Their faces were alight, not with reverence, but with hunger. Eyes darted across the room, whispering in glances, already dividing what they believed was theirs. My son sat tall at the head of the table, the seat he had claimed as his own, the seat where I once presided as father, provider, and anchor of the family. His wife leaned close, her smile sharp, as though she could already taste the inheritance. The grandchildren whispered among themselves, too young to understand the cruelty of greed, but old enough to sense the shift of power. I sat quietly in the corner, a chair placed not at the table but against the wall. They had not invited me, but I came anyway. My presence was an unwelcome shadow, tolerated only because the lawyer had insisted the entire family be present. No one met my eyes. To acknowledge me would have been to admit that I still mattered. So they spoke around me, over me, through me, as though I were a ghost in the home I had built. Their voices rose with anticipation, speculating about land, accounts, heirlooms. My son laughed softly, already certain of his triumph. Each word stung, not because I cared for wealth, I never had, but because every sentence revealed how little they valued what could not be divided. Loyalty, honor, love. To them, legacy was not memory, but money. The lawyer opened his folder, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze steady in a room charged with expectation. Silence fell. Forks paused above plates. Whispers died mid-sentence. And in that silence I sat still, my hands folded, my eyes lowered. They mistook my quiet for defeat, for frailty, for the surrender of an old man too tired to fight. But my silence was not weakness. It was patience. I had learned that storms do not announce themselves with noise. They arrive with a sky too calm, a stillness too heavy. I listened to the sound of the papers rustling, the weight of truth being lifted from its envelope. Every line written in my hand was about to fill the room, louder than my voice ever could. I felt no need to speak. My silence was not the absence of power. It was the preparation for its arrival. And as they leaned forward, eager to claim what they thought was theirs, I sat back, calm, steady, knowing that soon they would understand. My son leaned back in his chair, as though the room already belonged to him. His shoulders squared, his smirk steady. He did not wait for the lawyer's voice. He had already decided the outcome. To him, I was gone, erased, and what remained was a treasure chest he believed he had the right to open. He spoke with the authority of one who had never known true sacrifice, the kind of arrogance born not from strength, but from inheritance. His words cut through the silence like a verdict. We'll take care of things now. Not spoken as reassurance, but as dismissal, as if I were nothing more than a burden to be carried out with the garbage when the reading was done. I sat still, but inside me rose memories that his arrogance could never touch. I remembered carrying him through fevers, when his small body shook with sickness and I pressed cool cloths to his forehead until dawn. I remembered nights when he woke crying from nightmares, and I sat beside his bed, whispering until fear loosened its grip. I remembered working double shifts, sweat stinging my eyes, just to keep food on the table so he would never go to bed hungry. Those were my storms. Storms I endured so he could stand tall. And now he looked at me as though I were nothing more than an obstacle in his path. The room followed his lead, leaning toward him, laughing at his confidence. His wife's hand rested on his arm like a crown placed on a king. Relatives nodded, approving of his certainty, eager to attach themselves to his imagined throne. In their eyes I had already vanished. The man who once carried them all was now an afterthought, a shadow too weak to resist. Yet arrogance has a way of blinding the proud to the truth. He thought the lawyer's presence was a formality, a mere step toward his coronation. He thought my silence was consent, that my bowed head meant surrender. He could not see that every line of the letter waiting to be read was already sharpening like a blade, ready to cut through his illusions. I watched him bask in his own triumph, and though my chest ached with sorrow, I did not break. For arrogance is loudest just before it is silenced, and I knew the louder he smirked, the deeper the fall would be when ink spoke the words he had refused to hear. The lawyer's hands moved slowly, unfolding the letter with a care that made the air in the room grow heavy. The silence deepened, not the easy silence of family comfort, but the strained silence of waiting for judgment. He cleared his throat, and for the first time in years, my words returned to that table, though not from my mouth, but from the paper I had written by candlelight. My heart poured into every line. His voice was steady, yet each syllable struck like iron on stone. To my family, who once called me father, this is my final letter. The room froze. The grandchildren's whispers stilled. My son's smirk faltered. My daughter-in-law's eyes sharpened with unease. Words carry weight when they are spoken, but when written in ink they become unshakable, undeniable. These words, my words, filled the space like a storm cloud gathering over their feast. I saw in their faces the realization that this would not be the smooth coronation they expected. This was not a transfer of wealth. It was a reckoning. For years they had silenced me at the table, turned my chair into emptiness, reduced my voice to background noise. But here, in the lawyer's measured cadence, my voice was undeniable, echoing louder than their laughter had ever been. I remembered the night I wrote those opening lines, my lamp burning low, the ink staining my fingers. I had paused many times, wondering if love still had room within the words, or if only sorrow remained. But in the end, truth shaped them, and truth cannot be softened. I wrote not to accuse, but to reveal, not to wound, but to make them remember what they had chosen to forget. The first line was a hammer against their illusions, the reminder that before inheritance, before possessions, before greed, there had been family, and it was they who had severed that bond, not I. As the lawyer's voice filled the room, every smile grew stiff, every eye dropped to the table. The weight of truth had entered the room, and nothing would be the same. The lawyer's voice carried my memories into the room, each word pulling back the veil they had so carefully drawn over the past. The letter spoke of nights without sleep, when I worked until my hands bled just to keep a roof above their heads. It told of mornings when I left for work with an empty stomach so they could eat, of winters when I wore the same threadbare coat year after year so they could have new ones. These were not grand gestures, not the kind of sacrifices carved into monuments, but the quiet offerings of a father who gave everything and asked for nothing. I saw them shifting in their seats, the arrogance that once filled the air thinning into discomfort. My son's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering down to the table. My daughter-in-law's smile, once so sharp, faded into a strained mask. The children glanced at one another, uncertain, as though hearing for the first time a story they had never been told. My words had become mirrors, and in those mirrors they saw debts that could never be repaid. I remembered those years vividly, the nights I came home too tired to speak, yet still knelt by their bedsides to kiss them goodnight. I remembered patching torn shoes with my own hands so they would not walk to school in shame. I remembered counting coins late at night, whispering prayers over the small pile, hoping it would stretch far enough to buy books, food, medicine. Each memory was etched into my flesh, into my bones, yet to them those years had dissolved into nothing, discarded like old furniture. But ink remembers what people choose to forget, and now, as the lawyer read my words, those memories returned not as whispers, but as truth carved into stone. Every line was a reminder that their comfort had been built on my sacrifice, that their laughter at my trembling hands had been paid for by the strength of those same hands decades ago. The room grew colder, heavier, not because the fire dimmed, but because the weight of unacknowledged love pressed down upon them. They were no longer simply waiting for inheritance. They were facing the reckoning of their own ingratitude. And in that silence I felt no need to gloat. I had not written the letter to shame them, but to remind them. Yet reminders can cut sharper than accusations, and every word carved deeper into the pride they once carried so carelessly. The lawyer's voice grew softer as he reached the heart of my letter, the part I had written with trembling hands and steady resolve. I did not fill those pages with rage, for anger fades too quickly and can be dismissed as bitterness. Instead, I wrote with sorrow, with the weight of disappointment heavier than any storm. I told them that betrayal does not need shouting to wound. It comes quietly, when love is taken for granted and respect is stripped away, piece by piece. I did not accuse them of failing to love me. I knew that love had long since been replaced by calculation and pride. Instead, I wrote the words that could not be erased. Blood alone does not make family. Respect does. That single line was the knife that pierced deeper than any curse. For they could deny affection, they could ignore gratitude, but they could not pretend that their scorn had not bled respect from our bond until nothing remained. I remembered the nights I sat awake, wondering where I had gone wrong. Was it in giving too much, shielding them so thoroughly from hardship that they never learned its lessons? Was it in carrying every burden in silence so they grew blind to the weight I bore? I had thought I was protecting them. Instead, I had raised children who could look upon the man who sacrificed for them and see only weakness. And that realization was the greatest sorrow I carried into those pages. Around the table, silence thickened. My son's smirk was gone. replaced by a tightness in his throat he could not disguise. His wife looked away, her hands folded in restless irritation, as though she wanted to dismiss my words but could not. Even the younger ones, the grandchildren who had learned to echo their parents' disregard, lowered their eyes. They had expected rage, the angry scratching of a bitter old man. Instead, what met them was calm, a calm so steady it felt unshakable. And in that calmness they saw the truth. They had not been condemned in fury, but judged in sorrow. There is a shame heavier than any punishment, and it comes when one realizes they are guilty without being screamed at. My letter did not thunder, it whispered, and in that whisper was the weight of all that had been lost. They thought they had stripped me of dignity, but in that moment it was their dignity that cracked, their pride that crumbled. For respect, once gone, cannot be bought back with gold, nor replaced with titles. It leaves a void that wealth cannot fill, and they were beginning to feel it settle in their bones. The words from the letter lingered in the air long after the lawyer's voice had fallen silent, and something in the room shifted. It was faint at first, like the stirring of wind before a storm. A cousin leaned forward, his eyes no longer on my son, but on me. An aunt lowered her gaze, ashamed, as though she had suddenly remembered the meals I once paid for when her own table was empty. Whispers began to rise among them, hushed but insistent, carrying a new weight. The tide of the room was turning. For so long, every eye had looked to my son as the heir, the rightful successor, the one who would carry the family's name. But now, as the truth unfolded in ink, their admiration faltered. They no longer saw a confident heir, they saw a man stripped bare by his father's quiet dignity. His smirk had vanished, his shoulders stiffened under the weight of the silence pressing against him. The same silence he had mocked in me now wrapped itself around him, suffocating and heavy. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, making no effort to defend myself. For the letter was doing what I no longer needed to attempt. Dignity, once buried under their scorn, began to rise again, not because I demanded it, but because the truth had demanded it for me. I had no crown, no wealth spread before me, no applause, yet I felt taller in that moment than I had in years, because the eyes of those around me, eyes that had been blind for too long, finally began to see. It was not wealth that restored me, nor inheritance, nor titles. It was memory. As they listened, they remembered who had carried them through storms, who had provided when there was nothing left, who had been the silent architect of their comfort. And in that remembering, the balance of the room shifted. My son's face burned as he tried to hold their gaze, but their eyes slipped past him, unwilling to feed his arrogance any longer. There is a power in truth that no pride can withstand. It does not shout, it does not strike, it simply reveals. And revelation has a way of clearing smoke, showing who stands on stone and who stands on sand. That night, I felt the stone beneath my feet again, steady and unyielding. My son still held the seat at the head of the table, but for the first time, everyone could see the chair meant nothing without the respect that gave it weight. That respect, piece by piece, was drifting back toward me. The lawyer's hand trembled slightly as he turned the page, and the air in the room grew sharper, as though everyone was holding their breath. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the unveiling of numbers, deeds, accounts, the treasure chest they believed already theirs. My son sat forward, hungry for confirmation of the empire he thought he had inherited. His wife's eyes gleamed, her fingers drumming against the polished wood with impatience. But the words that followed did not feed their greed. They destroyed it. The assets were not divided as they expected. The lawyer's voice was calm, but each sentence struck like thunder. The properties entrusted to scholarships for children who could not afford education, the savings directed to hospitals and charities that had once helped us when we had nothing, the land given to ensure my grandchildren's futures, not to their parents but directly to them, safeguarded from the poison of arrogance and cruelty. To those who had shown kindness in small ways, I had left tokens of gratitude, a neighbor who once brought me food in a hard winter, an old friend who never turned away when others did. The silence in the room was not empty, it was suffocating. My son's face collapsed from pride into disbelief, his skin pale, his lips pressed tight in a fury he could not release. His wife's triumph shattered, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for someone to blame, but there was no one. The grandchildren's eyes widened in wonder, realizing that the legacy was not gold in their parents' pockets, but seeds planted for their own futures, waiting to bloom. I sat in the corner, unmoving, as their certainty crumbled. They had believed legacy meant wealth they could consume, but my legacy was never for those who mocked me. It was for those who would carry forward what I had lived for: hard work, compassion, honor. Wealth in the hands of the ungrateful is wasted. Wealth placed in the service of memory becomes eternal. The lawyer read on, his voice steady, his eyes never leaving the pages. Every word unmasked the truth they had tried to bury, that I had seen their betrayal, I had felt their dismissal, and I had chosen justice, not by denying them with anger, but by ensuring they could not profit from cruelty. My silence had not been surrender, it had been preparation, and now the inheritance they expected was gone, redirected by ink, sealed beyond their reach. They had around me, whispers rose again, but this time they carried no admiration for my son. Instead, they carried awe, shock, and a quiet respect for the man they thought had grown too weak to matter. The will revealed more than distribution of wealth. It revealed the heart of a father who gave until his last breath, but who also knew when to draw a line between love and betrayal. My son's face, drained of color, as though the very blood had abandoned him. Only moments before he had sat tall, confident, draped in the invisible crown of an inheritance he thought unquestioned. Now, as the lawyer's words echoed in the room, that crown shattered. His empire of entitlement, built on greed, arrogance, and the certainty that I was too weak to resist, collapsed in minutes. The weight of truth pressed down on him heavier than any debt, and for the first time, he looked small in the chair he had claimed so boldly as his throne. The silence that followed was unbearable for him.
But necessary for me.
I did not gloat, I did not rise, I did not strike him with words. I sat still, my quiet dignity louder than his years of dismissal. He had called me not family, cast me out as if blood could be severed with cruelty. Yet in that very moment, as the ink of my letter revealed where my true legacy had been entrusted, it became clear to everyone in that room who truly carried the family's name. It was not the son who mocked his father, but the father who had sacrificed without praise, who had carried storms without complaint, who had chosen truth over revenge. His hands clenched against the polished table, trembling not with age, but with humiliation. He searched the room for allies, but found only averted eyes. Those who had admired his pride now looked at him with unease, ashamed of their silence, unwilling to carry his arrogance any longer. The same relatives who once leaned toward him leaned away, their loyalty shifting like sand under his feet. His wife's face twisted with anger, but her anger was not enough to restore what was lost. Entitlement cannot survive when the foundation of respect has been stripped away. I watched without triumph, only with sorrow. This was not the victory of a man seeking revenge. It was the justice of a truth long denied. I had raised him to stand tall, but he had chosen to climb on my back instead. Now, without that crutch, he could not stand at all. His collapse was not only in his face or his posture, it was in his soul, the sudden awareness that he was nothing without the respect he had scorned. The lawyer's voice trailed into silence, the pages resting on the table like a final judgment. My son, who had believed himself heir to everything, now realized he was heir to nothing but his own shame, and that shame was heavier than any fortune he had hoped to claim. There was no shouting when the last lines of the letter were read, no raised voices, no storm of curses, no pounding of fists against the table. Justice did not arrive with fury. It arrived in silence, in the steady rhythm of words written long before this night, words that could not be twisted or denied. Betrayal had spoken first, cruel and careless, stripping me of my place and my name. But the final word was mine, and it came not from bitterness, but from truth preserved in ink. I had not written for vengeance. I had written so the world, and more importantly my family, would remember who I was, what I gave, and what I stood for. That paper carried more weight than any inheritance could, because it held the story they had tried to erase. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every drop of sweat that built the walls around them. It was all there, undeniable, unerasable. As the lawyer folded the pages, the silence that followed was heavier than thunder. My son slumped in his chair, his pride broken, his illusions shattered. His wife's glare had turned into emptiness, her hands gripping the table as though she could anchor herself against a truth too strong to deny. The others in the room, who once admired his arrogance, now avoided his eyes. They understood, in ways they never had before, that justice is not always fire and fury. Sometimes it is quiet, patient, inevitable, like a tide returning to the shore, sweeping away everything false in its path. I sat in the shadows, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I had not needed to raise my voice nor defend myself against their cruelty. The letter had done it all, carrying dignity where my silence once stood alone. And though they had cast me aside, I had risen, not with power, but with honor. Justice had arrived, not for me alone, but for the truth of every parent who gives everything and receives betrayal in return. The final word belonged not to those who mocked me, nor to those who dismissed me, but to the father they had tried to erase. My voice carried on the trembling breath of the lawyer, filled the room one last time, and left its mark. They could scoff at my wrinkles, laugh at my trembling hands, push away my chair, even close the door in my face, but they could not silence the truth. And on this night, the truth had spoken louder than all their years of cruelty combined. When the lawyer folded the letter, the paper made a sound so small, and yet it carried more weight than all the years of their laughter, their whispers, their dismissals. The sound marked an ending, but it was not mine. It was the ending of their illusions, the final crumbling of the false empire they had built on arrogance. The room was frozen. Forks lay untouched. Glasses sat heavy with untouched wine. Eyes that once burned with greed now stared into emptiness, unable to look at me, unable to look at each other. It was as if the truth itself had blown through the walls and left nothing standing but memory. I rose slowly from my chair, my hands steady, my breath even. My body was aged, my steps measured, but there was strength in the silence that followed me. I did not need to speak, for the letter had said everything. I had been cut off, cast aside, reduced to a shadow by the very sun I had carried through storms. The son who once clung to me when fever racked his body, the son whose life was carved from my sacrifices. He had told me I was no longer family, but family is not declared by arrogance nor erased by betrayal. Family is written in sacrifice, in love given without condition, in truth preserved when memory fails. And that truth, my truth, had now been set before them, in ink that could not be torn apart. The room seemed to shrink around them. My son sat stiff, his face pale, his pride in ruins. His wife clutched the table as though it might hold her up, her eyes sharp with anger but dulled by defeat. Relatives shifted uncomfortably, unable to deny what they had heard. They had seen me mocked, pushed aside, stripped of dignity, but now they had seen justice, not through rage, not through vengeance, but through quiet truth, and it was enough. I walked toward the door, each step a reminder that my worth had never depended on their approval. My legacy was not in their hands, not in the wealth they hoped to claim, not in the seat they tried to steal at the table. My legacy was in the children who would one day learn the full story, in the scholarships that would give strangers the future my family took for granted, in the hospitals that would heal in my name, in every stone of the house I had built that would still stand long after their pride had crumbled. My name had been mocked, erased from walls, replaced in photographs, but it had already carved itself into eternity, carried not by those who betrayed me, but by the truth that betrayal could not erase. As I reached the doorway, I paused for a moment, though I did not turn back. They had expected me to beg, to plead for recognition, to demand respect that had long been denied. But I needed nothing from them. They could keep their silence, their shame, their hollow pride. I had my dignity, my truth, my legacy, and those would outlive them all. The silence in the room was absolute. No one dared to speak, for they knew that words would only deepen their shame. The man they had dismissed, the man they had mocked as useless, the man they had told was not family, that man had walked out taller than all of them, not in body, but in soul. For they now understood too late that family cannot be erased by arrogance, that respect cannot be replaced by greed, and that a legacy built on sacrifice is stronger than betrayal. I stepped into the night, the cold air filling my lungs, the snow crunching beneath my feet. Behind me was a house filled with silence, a family bound now not by love, but by the echo of truth they could never unhear. Ahead of me was the freedom of knowing that my name, my work, my life were already written in places they could never touch. My son had cut me off, but he had cut himself off from the very legacy he thought he would inherit. And in that moment, I knew with unshakable certainty I had lost nothing. They had.